'Twas just another busy afternoon at the Grandview Hotel. The sun shone brightly through the lobby windows, casting a warm glow across the polished marble floors. Guests checked in and out, bellhops rushed by with luggage, and the air was filled with the low murmur of conversations. Everything seemed normal. But in the midst of the ordinary, something extraordinary was about to happen. John, a hotel worker, was cleaning the lobby as he usually did. He had worked at the hotel for over 5 years. His job was simple, keeping the lobby clean and greeting guests with a smile. But John had learned over the years that there was more to life than sweeping floors and wiping down windows. People came and went, but it was moments like this one that could change everything. Across the lobby, a family entered the hotel. A mother, father, and their young baby. The baby was in a stroller, her small face bright with curiosity as she gazed at the new surroundings. The mother looked tired, her eyes heavy with exhaustion. The father, tall and wearing a suit, was busy with his phone as they made their way toward the elevator. John didn't pay much attention at first. It wasn't unusual for families to pass through the lobby. But then he heard it, the sound of a baby crying. At first, it was soft, almost a gentle whimper. But within moments, it grew louder and more frantic. John looked up, scanning the lobby for the source. It didn't take long for him to spot the family. The baby was no longer cooing or babbling. She was gasping for air, her face turning red. The mother's face was filled with panic as she frantically patted the baby's back, trying to calm her down. John's heart skipped a beat. He had never seen anything like this before. The baby was choking. The mother's panic was clear. She began to scream for help, but in the chaos of the busy hotel, no one seemed to notice. Guests walked by, oblivious to the desperate situation unfolding in front of them. John's eyes quickly scanned the lobby. It was as if time slowed down. He saw the panic in the mother's eyes, and he knew he had to act fast. Without thinking, John rushed forward. His heart raced, and his palms began to sweat. But there was no time to hesitate. The baby was in danger, and he was the only one close enough to help. "Excuse me, ma'am. I know CPR. Please step aside," John said, his voice calm but firm, as he gently moved the mother aside. The father, still holding his phone, looked at John with confusion. But when he saw the seriousness in John's eyes, he stepped back without hesitation. John took a deep breath and knelt down in front of the baby. He carefully checked her airway, noting that something had lodged in her throat. It was a small toy, one that the baby must have picked up along the way. The mother stood frozen in place, watching, her eyes wide with fear. With steady hands, John started performing the Heimlich maneuver, pressing against the baby's back in rhythmic motions. He could feel the pressure building, his mind focused entirely on saving the child. The baby's tiny body was stiff, and her breaths were shallow. John pushed harder, his movements controlled and precise. For a moment, it felt as though time stood still. John's heart pounded in his chest, and the room around him seemed to disappear. All he could focus on was getting that tiny toy out of the baby's throat. Then, with a sudden gasp, the baby let out a loud cough. John quickly turned her onto her side, and she coughed again, this time with more force. The small toy flew out of her mouth and landed on the floor, a tiny plastic object that had nearly cost her life. The baby began to cry again. But this time it was different. It was the sound of a healthy, breathing child. The mother, who had been holding her breath the entire time, let out a sob of relief. She hugged her baby tightly, thanking John over and over again. The father, still shocked, stood speechless. John stood up, his legs a little wobbly. He felt a rush of adrenaline, but also a wave of calm wash over him. The baby was safe. The crisis was over. But as John turned to step away, something caught his eye. The hotel manager was standing at the entrance of the lobby, watching the scene unfold. His expression was unreadable. John didn't think much of it at the time. His focus was entirely on the family, who were still thanking him profusely. "Thank you. Thank you so much. The mother kept repeating. We don't know what would have happened without you. John smiled awkwardly, nodding. It was nothing, ma'am. Just doing my job. But as he turned to leave, he noticed that the manager had stepped forward, his eyes narrowing. John's heart sank. Something about the manager's look didn't feel right. It was only then that John realized something. Despite all the praise, despite saving a life, there was still something he hadn't expected. The manager didn't seem pleased. The baby's life was saved, but John couldn't shake the feeling that this was just the beginning of something much more complicated. The unexpected consequence. John's heart was still racing as he walked away from the scene. The baby was fine now, safely cradled in her mother's arms, but the adrenaline hadn't worn off. His mind kept replaying the moments he spent performing CPR, the pressure of saving a life weighing on him. He couldn't help but feel proud. He had done the right thing. But as he reached for his cleaning cart, ready to return to his duties, he noticed something. The hotel manager was still watching him from the other side of the lobby, his arms crossed and his expression hard to read. John felt a sense of unease settle in his stomach. He had saved the baby's life. Why was the manager looking at him like that? Before John could figure out what to make of the situation, the manager called out to him. John. The manager's voice rang out across the lobby, sharp and demanding. John turned around, unsure of what to expect. Can I speak with you for a moment? The manager's tone was cold, and John could sense the tension in the air. John hesitated for a moment, glancing at the grateful family who was still standing near the elevator, clearly shaken but relieved. The baby was doing well, and they had been expressing their thanks for the past few minutes. He had helped them. Surely that was a good thing, right? Of course, sir, John replied, walking cautiously toward the manager. His stomach churned with an uncomfortable feeling that he couldn't shake. The manager gestured for John to follow him as he walked toward a small office in the back of the hotel. John knew this part of the hotel well. This was where staff meetings took place, and where employees were often called in for various discussions. But something about this felt different. Once inside the office, the manager closed the door behind them, his face expressionless. John, the manager began, his voice low and controlled. What you did back there was unprofessional. John blinked, unsure of what he had just heard. Unprofessional, sir? He asked, trying to keep his voice steady. Yes, I understand that you were trying to help, but you disrupted the entire lobby. The guests were waiting for their check-in, and you caused a scene. The manager's words came out quickly, as if he had rehearsed them. We're a hotel, John. We're here to provide a smooth, uninterrupted experience for our guests. What you did today could have damaged the hotel's reputation. John felt a wave of confusion wash over him. Sir, I saved that baby's life, he said, trying to keep his voice calm. She was choking. There was no one else around to help. The manager didn't flinch. I understand that, but you should have known better. We have protocols in place for emergencies. You should have called for medical assistance right away. Instead, you handled it yourself and caused a scene. John couldn't believe what he was hearing. This wasn't about the baby's life anymore. It was about the image of the hotel. The manager didn't seem to care that a life had been saved. All that mattered was the potential disruption to the hotel's operations. I did what needed to be done, John said, his voice growing more firm. That baby would have died if I hadn't acted. I didn't have time to wait for help. I saved her. The manager's expression hardened. You should have thought about that before acting on your own. I don't care if you're a hero or not. You've put us in a difficult situation. I'm going to have to report this to higher management. John's mind was spinning. He had always known that the hotel's focus was on service and profit, but he had never imagined they would treat something like this as a liability. I saved a life, John repeated, as if trying to make sense of what was happening. The manager sighed, shaking his head. And that's exactly why you're being placed on probation. We can't have you taking matters into your own hands like that. John's heart sank. Probation. He couldn't believe it. After everything he had just done, this was the consequence he was facing. Before John could respond, the manager stood up, signaling that the conversation was over. You can go now, John. I'll have HR contact you with further details. I suggest you stay out of the way for the next few days. You've caused enough trouble. John stood there, speechless. He had just saved a baby, but now his job was at risk. The manager's cold demeanor left him no room for debate. As he left the office, John's mind raced. He couldn't understand how something as heroic as saving a life could lead to such an unfair punishment. How could the hotel prioritize its image over the safety of a child? With a heavy heart, John returned to the lobby, his cleaning cart still in tow. He glanced over at the family one more time. The mother smiled at him, her gratitude still evident. But as she walked out of the hotel with her baby in her arms, John felt a twinge of regret. He had done the right thing, but it seemed that the world didn't always reward heroes. As he resumed his work, John couldn't shake the feeling that this was far from over. There were bigger forces at play here, and he was about to find out just how much trouble his actions would bring. The consequences of his heroism were only just beginning. The fallout begins. John walked out of the office, feeling like the weight of the world was pressing down on his shoulders. His mind was in a fog, trying to make sense of everything that had just happened. He had saved a life, yet now he found himself on probation. How could this be real? It was like something out of a nightmare. As he made his way back to the lobby, he could see the hotel staff moving around, working like nothing had changed. But to John, everything felt different. He had gone from being the hero to being treated like a problem. He felt a deep sense of betrayal. When he reached his station, he tried to focus on his duties, sweeping the floor, pushing his cleaning cart along the shiny hotel floors. But his mind kept drifting back to the incident. He couldn't help but think about the baby, the terrified look in her mother's eyes, the relief when the baby had taken her first breath after the choking stopped. That moment had been the highlight of his day, and now it felt like it was all for nothing. His thoughts were interrupted when the front desk clerk, Emma, walked over. She looked concerned, her eyes searching his face for an answer to a question she hadn't asked yet. "John, are you okay?" she asked softly, her voice full of empathy. "I saw what happened in the lobby. You did a great thing today. That baby's mom is so grateful." John forced a smile, though it didn't reach his eyes. "Thanks, Emma, but I don't think the management sees it that way." Emma's brow furrowed. "What do you mean?" John lowered his voice, glancing around to make sure no one else was listening. "I'm on probation. They don't care that I saved the baby. They're more concerned about the scene I caused." Emma's eyes widened in disbelief. "What? That's ridiculous. You saved a life. How could they punish you for that?" John sighed and leaned against the counter. "I don't know, but it's happening. They said I should have waited for the medical team instead of acting on my own." Emma shook her head, clearly upset. "That's insane. If you hadn't done something, who knows what would have happened to that baby? You did the right thing." John gave her a sad smile. "Yeah, I thought so too. But I guess they don't see it that way. I'll have to deal with whatever comes next." Before Emma could respond, the hotel manager appeared from around the corner. John stiffened, bracing for another uncomfortable conversation. The manager's cold, businesslike expression made it clear that he had nothing kind to say. "John," the manager said, his voice sharp, "I've spoken to HR about the situation. They'll be in touch soon. In the meantime, I expect you to keep your head down and avoid any further disruptions." John's hands clenched into fists at his sides, but he bit his tongue, not wanting to make the situation worse. He nodded stiffly. "Understood, sir," John replied, though his voice was tight with frustration. The manager gave him a curt nod before turning away and walking off. John could feel his anger building, but he didn't want to make a scene. He had already caused enough trouble for one day. As he continued his work, he couldn't help but feel like something wasn't right. His punishment felt too harsh for the situation. He had done what any decent person would have done. But to the hotel, it wasn't about what was right. It was about what was convenient for them. John glanced at the clock. It was nearly time for his break, and as much as he dreaded facing the rest of the day, he couldn't afford to lose his job. He needed the paycheck. He needed to prove to himself that he wasn't just some troublemaker. But right now, he didn't know how he was going to do that. As he grabbed his jacket and headed out into the back alley for a moment of fresh air, he noticed something strange. The hotel manager was talking to a group of people near the service entrance. 2 men in dark suits and a woman in a long coat. They looked like they were part of a meeting, but they were talking in hushed voices, glancing over at John every now and then. John couldn't help but feel a sense of unease. What was going on? Who were these people, and why were they so focused on him? He shook his head, trying to push the thoughts aside. He had enough to deal with already. But as he stepped outside into the cool air, he couldn't shake the feeling that this situation was far from over. The hotel's cold response to his heroism was just the beginning. Something bigger was brewing, and he was about to be caught right in the middle of it. The hidden agenda. John sat alone in the small break room, his hands wrapped tightly around a cup of lukewarm coffee. He stared blankly at the wall, his mind racing with the events of the past few hours. He had saved a baby's life, yet here he was, sitting in a cold, dimly lit room, punished for doing what any decent person would have done. His phone buzzed, snapping him out of his thoughts. It was a message from Emma. "Are you okay? They're talking about you in the front office." John frowned. Talking about him. What else was there to say? His thoughts swirled as he quickly typed back, "I'll be fine. Just need some time." But as he pressed send, the uneasy feeling from earlier crept back into his mind. He had noticed the strange conversation outside the service entrance. The 2 men in suits and the woman in the coat. They didn't look like ordinary guests or staff. Something didn't sit right about it. He had been in this hotel long enough to recognize that something was off. The hotel had a reputation for being pristine and perfect, always serving the rich and the elite. But John had learned over the years that the polished exterior of the hotel didn't tell the whole story. Behind the walls, there were secrets, power plays, and shady deals that no one talked about. It was part of the reason he had worked here so long. He had seen enough to know that staying in the background was the safest way to survive. But today felt different. Just as he was about to stand up and return to his duties, his phone buzzed again. This time, it was a call from an unknown number. John hesitated for a moment before answering. "Hello," he said, his voice cautious. A deep voice on the other end of the line spoke quickly, almost too fast to follow. "John, you don't know me, but I know you. I'm someone who's been keeping an eye on this hotel, and I think you're in trouble. You're being set up." John's heart skipped a beat. Set up? What was this person talking about? "Who is this?" John demanded, his mind racing. "Why should I believe you?" The voice on the other end lowered, sounding urgent. "Because there are people here who don't want the truth getting out. They've been covering up things that go far beyond your little incident with the baby. You need to be careful." John's grip tightened around the phone. His mind was in overdrive. What was going on? Was someone really trying to set him up? And if so, why? "Who are you?" John asked again, his voice now steady but filled with suspicion. The voice paused before answering. "Someone who's been watching. Someone who knows the game. They don't want anyone to get in their way. That's why they're pushing you down, even though you did the right thing. Keep your eyes open." Before John could respond, the line went dead. He stared at the phone, his thoughts swirling in confusion. Who was that? And what did they mean by they? John had always been the kind of person who believed in taking action, but now the stakes seemed higher than ever. Someone was playing a dangerous game, and he had no idea what role he was supposed to play. John set his phone down, his heart still racing. He had been thinking about the hotel's shady reputation for years, but never in his wildest dreams did he imagine that he could be at the center of something bigger. All he wanted was to do his job, keep his head down, and live a simple life. But now it seemed that wasn't possible. He thought about the strange meeting outside the service entrance. Could the people in suits be part of this? Were they connected to whatever was going on behind the scenes at the hotel? He needed to find answers, and fast. As he left the break room, a sense of dread washed over him. This wasn't just about a baby anymore. This was something much bigger, something that could change his life forever. John walked down the hallway, trying to keep his cool. He wasn't going to let fear control him. He had saved a life, and he wasn't going to let anyone take that away from him. But the feeling of being watched, of being targeted, was impossible to shake. Every step he took felt like it brought him closer to a dangerous truth, one that he wasn't sure he was ready to face. He passed by the front desk where Emma was talking to a few of the guests. She gave him a small smile as he walked by, but John could tell she was worried. He couldn't tell her everything. She didn't know the half of it, but he couldn't shake the feeling that things were about to spiral out of control. As John approached the elevator, he heard a voice behind him. "John, wait." He turned around to see the hotel manager walking toward him, his face stern. John's stomach sank. "What now? Can we talk for a minute?" the manager asked, his tone cold. John nodded, even though he felt a knot in his stomach. Something wasn't right. The manager's eyes were hard, and there was a certain tension in the air that made John uneasy. "Sure, let's talk," John said, though he couldn't hide the suspicion in his voice. As they walked to a quieter area, John couldn't help but feel like he was walking right into a trap. The manager stopped and looked at him, then spoke in a low voice. "We need to talk about the incident in the lobby," the manager said, his words clipped. "We're going to make sure this doesn't go any further, but we have to handle this delicately. There are people involved who aren't exactly happy with how things have been going around here." John's eyes narrowed. "What do you mean by that?" The manager's gaze flickered to the side, as if making sure no one else was listening. "You don't know everything, but soon you will. Just stay quiet, John. For your own good." John's heart raced. What was he about to get himself into? And who was the manager really working for? The secret deal. John's mind raced as he walked away from the manager's ominous words. He felt a tight knot in his stomach, the unease building like a storm cloud waiting to burst. Something wasn't right. The hotel, once a place of familiarity and routine, now felt like a trap, a maze of secrets he had unknowingly stepped into. He had saved a baby's life, but now he was tangled in a web of deception that stretched far beyond his simple act of heroism. The manager's warning echoed in his head. "Stay quiet, John, for your own good." But John knew he couldn't just sit back and let things unfold without knowing the truth. He had to find out what was really going on. John went back to his duties, but his focus was shattered. Every sound in the hotel, every whispered conversation, seemed to carry a weight of suspicion. As he moved through the halls, he noticed things he hadn't before: the hushed conversations between the higher-ups, the nervous glances exchanged between employees, the way people seemed to avoid his gaze when he walked by. Something was being hidden, and John wasn't sure if he was part of it or about to become a target. That evening, as John worked his shift, he overheard something that caught his attention. It was just a brief exchange between two guests in the lobby, but it was enough to send a chill down his spine. "You think they know?" one guest whispered to the other. "Is it too late to stop it?" The second guest looked around nervously, their voice dropping to a near whisper. "No, they're already in. The deal's been made. There's no going back." John's heart pounded in his chest. What were they talking about? A deal. The word echoed in his mind. The deal's been made. There's no going back. He needed answers, but who could he trust? The manager was clearly involved in something shady, and the guests seemed to be more aware of what was happening than he was. John's thoughts raced as he decided to take matters into his own hands. He couldn't just ignore the signs any longer. He needed to dig deeper. John didn't go home that night. Instead, he made his way to the security office in the back of the hotel. It was late, and most of the staff had already left for the day. He knew the security officer, Frank, would still be around, finishing his shift. Frank had always been a good guy, and John figured he could trust him with what was happening. Frank was sitting at his desk, eyes glued to the security monitors. He didn't seem surprised when John entered. "Can I help you?" Frank asked, raising an eyebrow. "I need to see the security footage from earlier today," John said, his voice low. "I need to know what happened in the lobby. Something's not right." Frank hesitated, his fingers hovering over the keyboard. John could tell he was debating whether or not to comply. After a tense moment, Frank sighed and turned the screen toward him. "Okay, but you didn't hear this from me," Frank said, his voice barely above a whisper. John nodded, a sense of urgency pressing on him. He watched intently as Frank rewound the footage to the moment the baby had started choking. John saw himself rush to the child's side, performing the Heimlich maneuver, but the footage didn't stop there. Frank scrolled through the timeline, and John's stomach churned as they reached the part he hadn't seen. The guests in the lobby, the ones who had been whispering about the deal. Frank paused the footage, pointing to the screen. "Look at this," he said quietly. John leaned in, his eyes scanning the video. There in the background were the same two guests he had overheard earlier. They weren't just talking to each other. They were speaking with someone else, a tall man in a dark suit who was standing by the elevator. His face was partially obscured, but his body language was unmistakable. He was giving instructions, his hand motioning toward the front desk. It was clear that they were discussing something important. "Who is that?" John asked, his voice tight with suspicion. "That's Mr. Blackwood," Frank said, his voice barely audible. "He's one of the investors who owns part of the hotel. He's always been around, but no one really knows much about him. He keeps to himself." John's mind raced. Mr. Blackwood. The name sounded familiar, but he couldn't place it. He had heard it mentioned in passing by some of the hotel staff, but no one ever seemed to have any concrete information about him. Was he involved in the deal the guests had been whispering about? Frank clicked the mouse, continuing to scroll through the footage. The tall man in the dark suit exchanged a few more words with the guests, then disappeared into the elevator. The footage continued, showing the aftermath of the choking incident, but John's mind was focused entirely on what he had just seen. This was bigger than he thought. "I need to talk to him," John said, his voice firm. Frank looked at him, eyes wide with concern. "Are you sure about this? Mr. Blackwood is dangerous. He's not someone you want to get involved with." John's jaw clenched. He had to do this. He couldn't let whatever was happening behind the scenes go unchecked. He had seen too much already to just walk away. "I don't have a choice," John said. "I need to know the truth." As he left the security room, his mind was already racing with the next steps. The pieces were starting to fall into place, but John knew this was just the beginning. There was something much bigger going on, and he was determined to find out exactly what it was, no matter the cost. The hidden agenda. The next morning, John couldn't shake the sense of danger that loomed over him. The night before, after the conversation with Frank, he had barely slept, his thoughts spinning in circles. What was Mr. Blackwood's real involvement with the hotel? Why had the guests been so secretive? And why was the hotel management so willing to cover up the incident with the choking baby? John's hands trembled as he tied his shoes and prepared for another long shift. He knew he couldn't just sit around waiting for answers. He had to act. The pieces of the puzzle were scattered, but John was determined to fit them together, no matter how risky it might be. As he walked into the hotel lobby, the morning shift was in full swing. Guests chatted cheerfully at the front desk, and staff members scurried around attending to various duties. But to John, everything felt different. The air seemed thicker, heavier, as if the walls were closing in. He wasn't just a hotel worker anymore. He was in the midst of something bigger, something dangerous. John spotted Maria at the front desk. She was the head receptionist, a woman with a sharp mind and an even sharper sense of loyalty. They had worked together for years, and she had always been someone John could trust. He hesitated for a moment before approaching her. "Maria, I need to talk to you," John said, lowering his voice so no one could overhear. "It's important." Maria looked up from her computer, her brow furrowing in concern. "What's going on, John? You look different." John glanced around, making sure no one was within earshot. "I need to know if you've heard anything about Mr. Blackwood, about the deal with the hotel." Maria's eyes widened in surprise. "What deal?" she asked, clearly taken aback. She leaned in closer, her voice barely above a whisper. "John, I don't know what you're talking about. Mr. Blackwood's a private investor. He doesn't really get involved in day-to-day operations. He just shows up occasionally." John's gut told him Maria wasn't telling the whole truth. He had seen the way people reacted when Mr. Blackwood was mentioned, as if he were some sort of shadowy figure lurking in the background. No one seemed to know much about him, but everyone treated him with respect or fear. "Maria," John said, lowering his voice even further, "I'm not stupid. I've seen the way people act when his name comes up. There's something happening here, something bigger than what I can see, and I need to know the truth." Maria hesitated for a moment, her eyes flicking nervously around the lobby. Then, with a resigned sigh, she spoke. "I'm not supposed to tell you this," she said, her voice barely audible. "But there's been talk around here. Rumors, mostly, about some kind of plan. I don't know the details, but it involves the hotel's ownership, who really controls it. It's not just Blackwood. There's a whole network behind it." John's heart raced as she spoke. "What do you mean, a network?" Maria looked around again, making sure no one was listening. "I don't know much, but I've heard whispers. There's some kind of underground group. They've been making moves behind the scenes for a while. They control a lot of businesses, not just this hotel. And they want more. They're planning something big, something that could change everything." John's mind was spinning. An underground group, a network of powerful people pulling the strings from the shadows. This was more than he had ever imagined. He had only stumbled into this by accident, trying to save a baby's life. Now, he was in the middle of a conspiracy he didn't fully understand, but one that could be dangerous for him and anyone who got too close. "Do you think Blackwood is involved in this network?" John asked, his voice tight with suspicion. Maria nodded slowly. "I don't know for sure, but I wouldn't put it past him. He's always been secretive. People are scared of him. He has connections, John. Powerful ones." John felt a chill run down his spine. Everything he had learned so far was pointing to one thing. Mr. Blackwood was at the center of something dark, and John was now tangled up in it. If he wasn't careful, he could become a target, just another piece in someone else's game. "What should I do?" John asked, his voice full of uncertainty. Maria gave him a sympathetic look. "You need to get out. You've already seen too much. They won't hesitate to get rid of anyone who gets in their way." But John couldn't walk away. He had come too far, and the truth was out of his reach. He needed to know everything, no matter the cost. "I can't leave." "Not yet," John said, determination settling in his chest. "I need to find out who's behind all of this and what they want." Maria looked at him with concern, but she didn't try to stop him. Instead, she gave him a small, encouraging nod. "Be careful, John. Don't trust anyone, not even me." As John walked away from the front desk, he felt a new weight settle on his shoulders. He had crossed a line. There was no going back now. Whatever this underground network was Whatever Mr. Blackwood's role in it, John was in too deep, and he had no choice but to keep pushing forward. Because the truth, no matter how dangerous, was something he couldn't live without. The unmasking. The walls of the hotel felt like they were closing in on John. He had spent days chasing whispers, piecing together fragments of information, and dodging questions from his coworkers. The paranoia gnawed at him, but now, more than ever, he was determined to uncover the truth. That night, after his shift ended, John decided it was time to confront Mr. Blackwood. His gut told him that the hotel owner had to be involved in whatever scheme was unraveling behind closed doors. Blackwood had been secretive from the start, always lurking in the background like a shadow, with his connections and powerful alliances. It was time for John to put everything on the line and face the man who had been pulling the strings all along. John didn't waste any time. He waited until the hotel was nearly empty for the night, when the last of the guests were tucked into their rooms and the staff had gone home. He slipped into the back offices, where Mr. Blackwood's office was located. The dim lighting and sterile atmosphere only added to the sense of dread that seemed to hang in the air. The door to Blackwood's office was slightly ajar. John took a deep breath, his pulse quickening, and pushed it open. Blackwood was sitting behind his desk, a glass of whiskey in his hand. His steely eyes locked onto John the moment he stepped into the room. For a brief moment, there was silence, an electric tension that filled the room. "You've been asking too many questions, John," Blackwood said coolly, his voice low and controlled. John stood his ground. "I know what's going on here. I know about the underground network. I know about the deals you've been making. And I know about the baby choking incident. It was all part of the plan, wasn't it?" Blackwood didn't flinch. Instead, he leaned back in his chair, regarding John with an unreadable expression. "You think you figured it out, don't you? But you're in way over your head. You don't understand the stakes of what's at play here." John's heart hammered in his chest, but he couldn't back down now. He had to know everything. "Then tell me, what's really going on?" The silence that followed was thick with secrets. Finally, Blackwood spoke, his tone almost admiring. "You've been a good worker, John. A loyal employee, but sometimes loyalty blinds people to the bigger picture. There's a reason why we needed that incident with the baby. There's a reason why we orchestrated it." John's blood ran cold as the realization hit him. The choking incident, his act of heroism, had been planned. Blackwood and his network had used it as part of a larger scheme. Why? John's voice was hoarse with disbelief. Why involve a child in all of this? Blackwood's eyes flickered with something dark, something John couldn't quite place. "Because people like you, John, you're the perfect distraction. While you were busy saving a life, you didn't see the bigger game being played. We control everything in this city. The hotel, the businesses, the people. And you." Blackwood stood up, walking around his desk slowly. "You were the perfect pawn. You were so focused on doing the right thing, you never questioned why." John was shaking now, a mixture of anger and fear coursing through his veins. "You used me. You used that baby, that family, to further your own agenda." Blackwood's smirk was cold and calculated. "In this world, John, you either use people or get used. It's survival of the fittest. And you were never meant to understand the game. You were just a piece in it. But now, I think you're ready to play." John felt a rush of panic, but he didn't back down. He had come too far to turn away now. "I'm not playing your game," he spat. "I'm going to expose you. I'm going to tell the police, the press, everyone." For a split second, Blackwood's expression hardened, but then he smiled again. "Do you really think you can stop it? You've seen too much, John. You're already too deep." John could feel his palms sweating. He knew Blackwood was dangerous. He could feel it in every word, every movement. But there was no turning back. He had to take a stand, no matter the cost. "I don't care what you think. I'm not afraid of you anymore," John said, his voice firm. For a moment, The room was eerily silent. Blackwood's eyes narrowed, and the tension seemed to thicken. Then, to John's surprise, Blackwood leaned back in his chair and laughed. It was a deep, unsettling laugh that echoed off the walls. "You're brave," Blackwood said, his voice calm again. "But that's your weakness. You don't see how far you've fallen into this web. You're already part of something bigger than you can imagine, and you'll never escape it." John stood tall, fighting the rising fear in his chest. "We'll see about that." Without another word, he turned on his heel and left the office. The door slammed behind him, but the weight of Blackwood's words lingered in the air like a bad smell. John knew what he had to do next. He couldn't let Blackwood and his network win. He had to find a way to take them down before it was too late. But as John left the hotel that night, his thoughts were dark and heavy. Blackwood had made it clear he wasn't just a hotel owner. He was part of something far larger, something more dangerous than anything John had ever faced. And if John was going to expose the truth, he would have to confront forces far more powerful than he had ever imagined. The final battle had just begun.